Hello everybody, welcome to 2024, can you believe it? And another episode on the Willys here. Before I get started, I just wanted to mention that we lost one of our dogs. She was 14 years and 1 month old. Her name was Allie. She really had an amazing life, and a lot of dogs don't get to live even to 14 years old. But even still, it's always sad to lose a pet. You know, they become part of the family. So this video is dedicated to Allie the dog, and we will miss you very much. Anyway, back to the video. I'm gonna call this the low-hanging fruit video because the weather is so crappy outside and it's gonna continue to be for a while. So I'm trying to stay indoors, and we're gonna try to tackle some of these, you know, quote, easy things on our list. First two items will be the water temperature gauge and the steering wheel. So the water temperature ascending unit is right there. And it's only got one wire connected to it. That wire goes through the firewall and up underneath the dash to the water temperature gauge. We have perfect continuity between the sending unit and the water temperature gauge, so we know there's nothing wrong with the wire itself connecting the two. So the problem either lies with the sending unit or with the gauge itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is replace the old sending unit with a new one, and we'll see if that fixes the problem. If not, then I'm not sure what we're going to do after that, because these gauges are not readily available for sale, and I don't know if that's something I can fix. But for starters, we have to drain some of the coolant out of the radiator to get it below the level of where the sending unit is, because right now if we just unscrewed it from the head and pulled it out, coolant would, you know, come gurgling out of there and make a big mess. All right, while the coolant is draining, let's address the steering wheel. Remember from the previous video, going down the road, going straight, the steering wheel looks like that. So number one, it's crooked. Number two, I have determined that it is in fact upside down. And I determined that by looking in owner's manuals and parts catalogs and other people's vehicles, service manuals, and all that led me to the belief that it's upside down. So I'm just gonna remove it. We're gonna clock it and put it on the right way. And don't judge by the orientation of the horn button, because that can come off and be put on any way. So we'll just pop that off first. If you remember from one of the previous videos, this little guy here was loose and it, in fact, fell out and was making the horn button rattle. So I think I'm going to put just a dab of glue on the end, and we're going to put it back in there so that doesn't happen again. All right, to get to this big nut, you have to remove the horn button ring. This is a 1 1/4 nut. That's clearly the mechanism for the horn. There's a spring in there. All right, I'm out in some better light here. Here is the nut, and here is the centerpiece horn button mechanism. It looks to me like it just sort of failed, or maybe this got twisted and twisted the wires and broke them off. Here is the nut. This is the top of the nut, and this is the bottom. You can see they're different. It's got a little raised area for whatever reason that might be. And no, it's not a washer that's stuck to it. It's part of the casting of the nut, it looks like. Sometimes when you get the nut removed from the steering wheels, you can just pull them right off. But a lot of times they've been on there for so long, they sort of get stuck on there, and you need to use some sort of a puller type tool to get it off the shaft. Yeah, I think we're going to need some type of a puller because it feels like it's on there pretty good. All right, well, I was off camera for about an hour probably, fiddling around with different kind of pullers. Of course, I didn't have the right one. It's kind of an odd shape here where, you know, in the center. And didn't want to break the steering wheel, didn't want to scratch it, so I didn't want to put any kind of tool on it. Under here, I finally found a generic puller for harmonic balancers and things of that nature, and I put it in the center like that, and put a couple screws down into the horn ring holes. And then it popped loose that way. It took me a while to figure that out, but I'm sure there's a a special tool that they make just for this application. Anyway, she's ready to come off. Some steering wheels are splined in the center, like this one. And some steering wheels have a keyway notch, or sometimes more than one keyway notch. So the idea is that it's just not a round shaft there. So when you put the steering wheel on, even if the nut isn't on it, it has no chance of spinning. It was like this, roughly, right? So we're going to take it off, we're going to clock it all the way around, and just slide it right back on. So I'm going to put it back on just like it was when we took it off. I'm going to put the raised part of the nut down and the flat part on top. And I'm going to go ahead and leave this little mechanism for the horn button, just because it's a good place for it and we won't lose it that way. Let me get that tightened down, then I'll bring you back and we'll do the horn button. So all three of these are loose inside these little holes, which is not a big deal when the horn button is on. But as soon as you remove the horn button, these things, the one on top, for example, is going to want to fall out from gravity when it's in the truck. So I'm just going to put a dab of glue on the end of all three of them, just to keep them up in their holes there, and it'll make it a little bit easier to deal with. I'm going to use some 5-minute epoxy if it isn't frozen. All right, we got our hardener and our epoxy mixed together. I'm just going to put a dab on the end of each one, like I said before. And by only putting a little dab on these, we'll be able to remove them in the future if we want. Looks like the way these are supposed to work, this is the horn button, of course, and this is the inner flange of the horn button. You can see there's holes for each one of those little deals that they're supposed to go down and kind of sit inside. Put it down like that, and then you can kind of feel when they lock into the holes. That's how it's supposed to fit, to give the horn button some give so you can actually press it down to operate the horn. All right, I've got the horn ring reinstalled on the steering wheel. And let's see about the orientation here. If we have the steering wheel straight across and the horn button straight up. Okay. And I'm really happy with that. I think it looks a lot better now than what it did before. All right, let's get this temperature sending unit replaced. I'm just removing the wire to start with. You don't want to lose this little nut. Definitely do not want to break off this sucker in the top of the head. That would be a problem. All right, there it is. Let's go compare this with the new one. Nice. Well, it looks like I bought the right one. Same as the old one, so that's good. So let's take a quick look at the old one. So we're just gonna have to keep our fingers crossed here. I'm not sure if this is gonna solve the problem or not, but it's not gonna hurt to get this old one replaced anyway. Okay, the new one is installed. I've got everything hooked back up. The only thing to do now is start the truck and let it warm up to operating temperature, and we'll check the gauge. All right, it's the next day now, and I've got the truck warming up. We're gonna take it for a drive. and see what the temp gauge does. Right now it hasn't moved at all. It's still on the top right corner of the C, and we'll keep an eye on it. Let's see how we do. I got the steering wheel a little bit too far to the left, so I'm going to have to adjust it when I get it back to the shop. We'll turn it. The needle is starting to come up a little bit. Turn the heater on. All right, that was another successful drive. No trouble at all with the truck. This truck has very similar speeds to my antique Model Ts. These cars of mine love to run between like 30 and 38, 35, somewhere in there. Yes, you can push them to 40, you could push them to 45. But at those speeds, these cars start to protest a little bit. They start to shimmy and shake, and it's just not necessary to go that fast. And this vehicle seems to be about the same. It really seems to like to cruise between 30 to 35 to 38 in that same range I mentioned with the Model T. And regarding the steering wheel again, I want to remove it once again and clock it just a couple splines to the right, because going down the road, it's kind of like that now. Yeah, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, but if we're going to do this, might as well get it right. So I'm going to get that repositioned off camera. No need to make you watch me do that again. Let's move it just a little bit to the right. Well, regarding the water temperature gauge, long story short, it still doesn't work right. Before we replaced the sending unit, the needle on the gauge didn't work at all. After I got the new one in and took it for a drive, then the needle actually did start working for the first time. However, the range between completely cold and operating temperature is very, very small. So I think what's going on here, inside the temperature gauge, there's a metal wire coil that I think physically gets hot and expands and actuates the needle on the gauge. But after 70 plus years of that little coil heating up and cooling down over and over and over again, that metal gets weak and brittle, and no matter how hot it gets, it never expands the same way it did when it was new. And if that coil doesn't expand properly, it's not going to actuate the needle on the gauge, and we're not going to get a true reading on the gauge. Now the problem is, this particular year, these particular gauges on this panel do not seem to be available for sale. So I can't purchase a new water temp gauge. So that's the first problem. We just can't go out and buy a new gauge and stick it in there. The second problem is, I don't think that gauge is something that can be fixed. Ultimately, this is not that big of a deal because this is just an instrumentation issue. We don't have an overheating issue. The gauge just doesn't work right. The cooling system in the truck works perfectly. The truck runs nice and cool like it should. In fact, it runs cooler than most other engines I've ever seen. As far as I have seen so far, this engine seems to run between 160 and 170 degrees versus most of the other internal combustion engines that typically run more like between 180 and 210. I could talk about this for 20 more minutes, but in summary, the cooling system in the truck works great. The gauge just doesn't work right. For now, I'm going to cross water temp gauge off the list just because there's nothing more that we can do about it. I'll just make a mental note of it, and maybe in the future we'll be able to find a reproduction gauge. All right, another bit of low-hanging fruit is the dash lights. I touched on that briefly in the last video. You know, it's a 6-volt system, but even still, the dash lights were a little dim, even for 6 volts. There's only 3 bulbs behind the instrument cluster. The speedometer has 1 bulb, the 2 gauges on the left share 1 bulb, and the 2 gauges on the right share 1 bulb. So I just replaced those 2 bulbs. And I think you can see in the photo here that we do have more illumination now with the new bulbs, especially on the left side. When I removed that old bulb from the left side, it had a physically smaller bulb on it than the bulb on the right side did. Like they were 2 different bulbs and the one on the left was smaller. Smaller doesn't necessarily always mean dimmer, but in this case, I think that's what's going on. It was a different bulb, it was a smaller bulb, and it wasn't putting out as much light. So I replaced them with 2 of the same size bulbs, and now we're getting more light from it. And it's quite a bit easier to read in the dark. And you guys were right about the dome light in the last video. The only thing that was going on was I twisted the light knob to the left, and that turns the dome light on. When I twist the knob back to the right, it shuts it off. So in the process of investigating the lights in the last couple of videos, I must have bumped the light switch to the left. So anyway, that's a quick fix. Just turn them off and we'll cross it off the list. All right, I want to do one last thing for this video, and we're going to get a peek inside the gas tank here just to make sure that it's not filled with rust and everything. I think we would have figured that out by now if it was. I had to pull the truck into the shop. There's just too much glare outside, but I think I got a pretty good picture now. I can actually move the camera around down inside the tank. So I think that's the bottom of the tank right there. I mean, maybe a couple little areas of mild corrosion and rust, but overall this looks very good. And the only reason I've waited so long to check the gas tank on this truck is because the fuel coming from the gas tank up to the engine, remember the sediment bowl has a glass bowl in it, and so does the fuel pump. You can actually see the fuel coming from the tank, and it looked clean to me. I didn't see any debris floating around in it or anything like that. So it was safe to assume that the gas tank wasn't full of rust based on what we saw up front by the engine. But anyway, it's good to get a camera down there and get our eyeballs on the tank itself just to be 100% sure. So we're going to cross off and erase the crooked steering wheel and the upside down steering wheel. We're going to cross off and erase the dome light. We're going to cross off and erase the dash lights. And we do have a plan for the tires now, and that is to replace the tires when the truck is all done and ready to go back on the road again. We'll replace them at that time, which I think is an excellent idea. So I'll just put a little asterisk by the tires, and we'll do that in the future. So that wraps up another episode on the Willys. More progress was made, so that's always good. Even if some of the stuff was low-hanging fruit, it's still stuff that had to be done. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll catch you on the next one. Take care.